very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. I want to start with one note of caution in regard to the use of cosmopolitanism, and want to put that up front because I don't really investigate it, or it's not at the center of my paper, but I do think it should be part of the general discussion. The caution about cosmopolitanism as a fashionable term covering anything and everything, and we should be aware of that. And I wanted to flag up here the point of consideration, perhaps, that universalist perspectives, both by sort of within theoreticians and the social local actors, might be worth sort of investigating or sort of taking on board a bit more. That may be something that substantially differentiates cosmopolitanism from other key terms that it in some way seems to replace nowadays. Yeah? And with this, I just wanted to quote one sentence from an ethnography of Kingston of Jamaican cosmopolitanism, written by a colleague of mine, Huon Wardle, published in 2000. And I think we could replace here the word Jamaicans by other cosmopolitan societies we know, and just to get sort of a comparative dimension going in that sense as well. Right, it says here, Jamaicans understand themselves as global citizens, as individuals who have the potential for making social and cultural connection with many parts of the world. This sense of self can be identified across multiple contexts: oral performance, music, kinship and friendship, economics and politics. It is also shaped by and reacts against manifest exclusionary practices in the countries that Jamaicans travel to and work in. And we have to imagine somewhat the agents along the Swahili coast in a similar manner, I suppose, and probably also many peoples that you in the audience know of. I also just wanted to point at Kwame Anthony Appiah's book on cosmopolitanism, in a sense, of course, written by a philosopher, but he's got this simple, the formula: cosmopolitanism is unity and difference. And though I don't want to work further here with Appiah, I think this is really something to be negotiated, and this is also in the background of my paper, unity and difference being negotiated and sought to be brought in balance with a view to the whole world by the social actors on the ground. Right. Now, the adjective cosmopolitanism is frequently used as an epithet in relation to the Indian Ocean, often in a somewhat lazy sense to suggest population movement and the sharing of intermingling of cultural values. This clearly needs to be scrutinized and qualified. Any conception of cosmopolitan society, as Edward Simpson and I pointed out in our edited collection, Struggling with History, ought to reflect the historical struggles on which it builds. And I'm going to pick up on that here and look a bit at the example of Mombasa. So there are then distinct patterns of social diversity to investigate that create the impression of unity. And the different values given to space, place, and history are important resources in the politics of home, and migrants may attempt to use the financial or moral gains of their own journeys to enhance their standing locally. Thus, we argued there, without social diversity, the unity of the Indian Ocean is a hollow idea, and so is cosmopolitanism and its theoretical corollaries. Now, by their contesting the primacy of a simple notion of cosmopolitanism as a way of looking at the Indian Ocean, we thought we'd be able to explore local views and experiences of travel and daily grind of life that do not necessarily bear directly on notions of elitism and tolerance that much of social literature suggests. Rather than viewing patterns of movement and trade as forces which inevitably reduce social diversity, we suggest that this history has created societies in which differences are recognized and individuals are, to a greater or lesser extent, equipped with the skill to navigate through such differences. Thus, if it makes sense at all to speak generally of Indian Ocean cosmopolitanism, it is in this sense, we argued, of social contestation, right, based on a struggle with history that is not so much shared as held in common. And in that sense, then, society in the Indian Ocean is not simply characterized by an unshakable sense of unity, but rather, or by the inextricable erosion of difference as time passes. Rather, the social history has created what we may call an ever-changing community of strangers, which who do not stray strangers. Yeah? So there's conflict, constant dynamics in that as well. Now, let's look at Mombasa a bit, and I will, my paper is in a way quite limited in that I'm picking Mombasa here as a case study to investigate some of the core historical dynamics and as to how this urban center was shaped and founded, and it's somewhat representative of the Swahili coast. Yeah? Mombasa and the Swahili coast then belong to the kind of social urban environment that invite and attract the adjective cosmopolitan, indicating a worldly outlook for openness and experience that goes well beyond monolithic borders of family and community connections, though is driven by them. Well over a millennium of social history linked to the trading networks of the Indian Ocean, and also a good 1,000 years of presence of Islam in the urban port settlements, and a long-established lingua franca of African origin, namely Swahili, which integrates vocabulary from a range of linguistically unrelated languages, most prominently Arabic, and social connections to kin all over the world. All these factors do play a role in the tendency to call Mombasa and the Swahili coast cosmopolitan. Now, if we look at if we put a historical focus on Mombasa here, I'm picking, as I said, it's selective instances. The first one being on the term Swahili in relation to Mombasa. So Swahili as a variable relation is a variable relational term and not a fixed category, which has become very clear. And at the end of the 19th century, then the term Swahili for the British colonials referred to the particularly cultured and literate civilization of the coastal towns. But only a decade or so later, they started to apply the term in an invertive, dismissive way to the growing African urban population, labeled as prone to be dishonest and lazy. I'm following the work here of Justin Willis, an East African historian. After 1920, the British introduced a more selective usage of the term, applying it exclusively to members of the patrician 12 tribes of the town, so the 12 central groups that constitute urbanity in Mombasa. Now, with a focus on the Mijikenda hinterland peoples, Willis introduces an analytic characterization of what the application of that term Swahili generally implied. And I quote, "Swahili were those of whatever origin whose personal network of patronage or clientage were located within the towns, participating in a patronage system based ultimately on access to the credit networks of the Indian Ocean." End of quote. This definition, I think, is helpful since it incorporates both patrons and clients of the system, and thus stays appropriate over various phases of historical change of the system and the usage of the ethnonym itself. But because of this, it is also provocative, since the Wangwana, the patricians, and their dependents, the servants and slaves, the so-called Watumwa, fall into the same general category. Or they're both linked to this term through these networks. Wealthy urban traders in town sought further dependence, since these were the ultimate sources of status and economic power, and thus welcomed these newcomers in. They became Muslims and were integrated into the trade and subsistence system of their new masters as part of the household. Willis maintains that for people of the hinterland, becoming Swahili in itself involved the acceptance of dependent status. For them, the label Swahili characterized the role of a client, a minor, someone dependent on his patron in the running of his everyday affairs. There were, however, many levels of dependency, and through success in trade, reward by the patron, or marriage, upward social mobility inside urban society was possible. Willis makes it clear that in the 19th and 20th century, Swahili clients, as members of the urban system, could be integrated into one of the 12 tribes, or the patrician Swahili elite of Mombasa. And they could even occupy a leading office. In that sense, they could transform their status from dependent to patrician, from Watungwa to Wangwana. Thus, while there was dependence, there was also the possibility of a radical improvement of social status within the system. My following two examples are related to this. If we look here, let me see. Mombasa, throughout its history, has integrated groups of related outsiders, just as we saw with the first example through the dependency systems, it also integrated competitors and enemies along the coastline by other city-states or port towns with which it was in rivalry. And thus, in a way, there is a, if there's anything as a continuity, that it's this leitmotif perhaps of integrating others into the own society, integrating difference, integrating diversity. And perhaps Mombasa can be seen then as a community of strangers of sorts. So a paradigm of the integration of related outsiders, or the paradigm of integration of related outsiders, is clearly visible in the instance of in the 17th century, when and here I'm following the historian Frederick Berg, when the particular social political structure of the Swahili community of Mombasa was created, namely based on these 12 tribes, so-called Thenashara Taifa. This happened because of political instability in the hinterland region at the time, causing movements of groups to Mombasa and in the town itself. A sequence of power changes, invasions, and sieges demographically resulted in the creation of an urban ruling class of groups of high social standing, but of diverse origin, from along the hinterland and northern coast of Mombasa. For the people from Kilifi and Mtwapa, these are settlements around the North Creeks of Mombasa, then first they and then others fled to security on the island from raids that they faced from peoples such as the Gala, now called Oromo, and Segeju, who were moving southwards along the coast. Thus, an urban core structure of 4 Taifa evolved on the island. So they were called the Mvita, the Jomvu, Kilifi, and Mtwapa, according to the places where they came from, around which incoming Taifa from the farther northern coast, the Pate, Faza, Shaka, Bajun, and Katwa, were grouped then, forming the 9 tribes, or Tisa Taifa. This process took until the end of mid-18th century. From the south and west of the island, the Kilindini, Tangana, and Changamwe Taifa merged forces on the island by the 1630s to form the 3 tribes, founding their own settlements of Kilindini in the southwestern half of the island. Not until much later, then around 1840, did the 3 tribes move into the proper town of Mombasa itself in response to the destruction of the town by Sultan Said. They settled in distinct neighborhoods south of the Court of the 9 Tribes, marking a point of reconciliation of a long rivalry between these 2 factions. This rivalry had shaped the internal dynamics of Mombasa politics in much of the preceding centuries. Berg described Mombasa as an exceptionally successful example of a pre-colonial Swahili city-state because it appears to be unique in the extent to which foreign Swahili were adapted into the social body, referring to these dynamics of the 12 tribes. They symbolize social diversity within a larger framework of unity in the urban system, and as such they mark the process of integration that has taken place. Again, one should keep in mind that these could only take place because of their common religion, their common trade interests, common language, and the town as a center and guarantor of sorts of political power and social interaction. So the long-term integration of outsiders from along the Swahili coast, but also from along the whole Indian Ocean trading system, helped to make Mombasa one of the most powerful Swahili city-states, while at the same time giving it the character of a fundamentally intercultural society, perhaps cosmopolitan society, one could say. Political and economic power increased since all of those who were integrated as groups and as individuals brought in their own ties of dependencies and contacts. The overall network of the city profited from this, as the establishment or continuation of trade relations were eased considerably. People from India, Persia, Hadramaut, Oman, Somalia, and the Comoros and elsewhere were integrated as traders and citizens of equal status. People from the African interior, upcountry and coastal hinterland were also integrated, but mostly as miners, dependents, slaves, and servants. All of them could, after time, become full members of society, legal citizens with rights and duties. As mentioned, there were certain social institutions that facilitated such integration and made it possible in the first place, namely Islam, trade, marriage, and the Swahili language. So in this sense, we may speak, in the case of Mombasa, we may refer to it as a particular example, perhaps, of Muslim cosmopolitanism. Yet such far-reaching processes of integration were connected also to an ideology of status, hierarchy, and dependency that characterized social life in Swahili towns just as much as the potential of absorption. So in the following, I'll touch a bit on that, and I'll look at core features and concept of Swahili ideologies and of self-representation, and how they relate to the coastal town's capacity of social integration. Under the surface of Swahili ideology and its focus, Swahili urban ideology and its focus on ungwana, namely civilization, in contradistinction to ushenzi, barbarism, the notion of utumwa, namely serfdom or slavery, has been at the basis of social dynamics. As an ambiguous concept, it represents social integration and subjection at the same time. In the Swahili context, utumwa, namely serfdom or slavery, can be seen as a process or channel of integration into society, while it is actually based on hierarchy and different levels of status. So let me fill that a bit further. In terms of ideology, Swahili society seems strongly ethnocentric. This may be astounding for an urban-centered social life that has been based so much on social integration. Yet a clear value-laden dichotomy between the us of the town dwellers and the them, the outsiders outside of town, can be distinguished. The sphere of civilization, ungwana, in the inside of town is juxtaposed, as I said, to Shenzi, the wilderness outside of it. Both terms signify the polarized ends of a spectrum of watu, human beings overall, and their only commonality seems to be their generic opposition to animals, the wanyama. Characteristics of ungwana are, obviously, descent and town dwelling, but also, importantly, refined behavior, politeness, good manners, adequate for people of urban status or the highest status, and the wangwana term is often translated as gentleman or nobleman as well. So this includes very importantly language and a refined vocabulary and the most elaborate ways of talking. Furthermore, being Muslim is part of this conception, and also being wealthy through trade. But this somewhat creates a difficulty which tends to subvert the dichotomy in a certain way. This is because wealth cannot be imagined or experienced except in relation to others. Those others are either servants, who somehow express or represent the wealth of their masters, or social peers who are more or less wealthy than oneself. For if all would be equally wealthy, the notion of wealth itself would be meaningless. Hence, the ideological and illusory character of the basic dichotomy between the wangwana and washenzi. If there were only noblemen and women on the one side and barbarians on the other, society of course could not exist. Thus, in the hierarchical order between these two poles, a variety of status levels of human beings who are part of society is tacitly implied and is actually shaping society in practice. These reflections uncover the logical. In practice, civilization cannot be based simply on such a binary opposition to wilderness. It is based on a system of dependency. It's based here on the system of dependency, in this case, utumwa. So there's no gentlemanliness, no civilization, urban civilization, no ungwana without utumwa. Thus, we can say that in the Swahili context, as elsewhere, urban society is based on inequality. To be recognized as mungwana, thank you, meaning to be accepted by other members of society as being of high status, one needs to be seen exercising control over inferiors, the watumwa. Of course, there are different levels of inequality, and so the category of utumwa, mediating between the binary opposition of ungwana and ushenzi, can be filled in a variety of ways, thus creating a more complex picture of society. And at the same time, there's also a variety of levels of ungwana, illustrating the internal complexity from the other side of the spectrum. So to summarize in regard to this point, the ambivalence of utumwa pinpoints the ambiguity of Swahili social dynamics between open integration and strict open integration on the one hand, and strict subjection to rules of status on the other. Swahili urban ideology could choose between these as desired. Utumwa, a dependency system linked to and established by Ungwana, in return made possible and sustained the Waungwana social class, but also posed a potential danger from within. And this kind of interdependence is crucial to Swahili social relationships. And, now, in this reconstruction, I was basically giving an interpretation of an internal urban Swahili ideology, which relates back to the other 2 points of how outsiders or sort of groups from the outside were integrated into the town. And I did this to have a sort of a bit of a backing or historical underpinning look at instances that have defined the character of this town that we tend to call and praise as cosmopolitan. Now, in conclusion, I wanted to very briefly look at a sort of a contemporary, an example of contemporary Mombasa that concerns more of my current research of how coastal Muslims in Kenya, of how we can see something of a cosmopolitan skill, if we want, evolving there through the way that coastal Muslims respond to the way that they're situated, on the one hand to pressures of the post-colonial state in which they are a minority, and on the other hand to certain pressures and dynamics within the Muslim Ummah where they sometimes see themselves as part of a kind of periphery. And I'm just basically summarizing here a final point of that for you that we could take on in discussion. So, if the Kenyan coastal community has experienced processes of transformation that have significantly reshaped their everyday life, from both directions, strong forces negating the particular Muslim community and its way of life here had to be absorbed, while on the one hand, this has led to a kind of dialectic in the social formation of Muslim identity. I mean here, the negation of their negation, leading to a positive reassertion of coastal Muslims themselves as Muslims. This scenario of a kind of double burden or double challenge may also, on the other hand, lead to other beneficial effects. What I mean is that being under pressure from these two sides as part of a Muslim minority in Kenya and in a somewhat peripheral area of the Muslim world, individual Muslims grow up in a social environment that may be challenging and tough, but also ultimately rewarding once the challenges have been sort of addressed and are tried to be negotiated. They experience strong pressures, but are also put in a position to accept and possibly even choose from offers of support and alliance from the outside. In this sense, the double periphery may be seen as providing a kind of privileged locus, as using a term by Michael Lumbeck here, who did research on Mayotte in the Indian Ocean. Having become used to dealing with such difficult social, political and ideological pressures in their everyday lives, those who do not resign and give in to them acquire valuable skills in the process. Among them, patience, endurance, a broader picture of the scope of available perspectives on society and on Islam through experiences and different kinds of educational opportunities. Because of the position they are in, facing two fronts, those persistent to struggle through become adept at negotiating the different demands and offers from various directions. They may be able to work themselves through several available options of Islamic ideologies, and by dealing with such challenges develop the potential to become much more independently, to become more independently minded and critical, as well as self-critical than they might have otherwise become. Being situated and on the double periphery thus may also ultimately offer benefits. By training intellect, endurance, sensitivity and persuasiveness of individual Muslims living in this setting, it sensitizes and prepares them for the quotidian struggles different to those faced in a more socially homogeneous Muslim context. And the concrete example you have in mind, I can't really go into that, but it's a young man who started sort of a particular radio show on a newly founded Islamic radio program, and he's become very active in facilitating and facilitating local debates in regard to issues that concern coastal Muslims as human beings, not just under the paradigm, under the perspective of Islam, but generally sort of an engaged, self-educated Muslim who's in a way pushing the point, and where I would now put the question forward: is this also kind of sort of cosmopolitan sort of training through the life experience that sort of exist on this in this situated, or that are related to this situatedness on the double periphery, as I call it. So, and this, to conclude, links us up with a kind of skill that I pointed to in the introduction when I said that perhaps if cosmopolitanism has a particular value in negotiating difference and diversity, it's that the kind of exposure to it creates or lets us gain particular skills that then makes us perhaps sort of more conscious social actors who look across boundaries and integrate also the kinds of experiences and things that other speakers early on were talking about. So, thank you. With that, I'll close.